Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think all of us understand the passions that this topic elicits. But in my view, decisions in this body on everything, and especially this topic, should be driven by facts and the data and by the Constitution, not by passion. So I'd like to make 4 points briefly. Number one, machine guns are already functionally illegal. When this topic is discussed in the public forum, a great many people, when they hear the phrase assault weapon, believe that what is being discussed is fully automatic machine guns. Senior Senator from California made reference to an AK-47, I believe wielded by a gang member. An AK-47 is a fully automatic machine gun that is functionally illegal today. Tragically, gang members don't tend to follow gun laws. Number two, this bill, the data demonstrate, would be singularly ineffective in preventing violent crime. That, I think, is not surprising because, as the hearings on this bill demonstrated, the weapons that would be prohibited by this bill are functionally identical to semi-automatic deer rifles, millions of which are in circulation. And this bill targets cosmetic features on guns, cosmetic features that at the end of the day make the guns appear scary, but does not alter the basic mechanism. And I would note that we don't have to hypothesize about the effectiveness because we in fact have seen what happens when a very, very similar bill is in effect. The prior assault weapons ban was in effect for a decade. 3 times the Department of Justice funded studies on that assault weapons bill, and 3 times the studies were not able to find any statistically significant impact on violent crime as a result of the assault weapons ban. That's 3 studies in a row, which is very difficult to get away from. And indeed, since the assault weapons ban expired, we now see murders by rifles are roughly half today what they were when the assault weapons ban is in effect. So this is not a law that I think has any reasonable prospect of reducing violent crime, something I know everyone on this committee would like to see violent crime reduced. Indeed, I would suggest, as my third point, that if the real objective is reducing violent crime, we should be devoting our time to far more effective steps. We should be devoting our time to laws that target violent criminals. We should be devoting our time to laws that improve the NICS background check. We heard testimony that 18 states right now have submitted 100 or fewer mental health records to the background check program. That's a serious problem. I would note my home state of Texas has submitted over 200,000 mental health records to that background system. And I fully expect to support on the floor legislation that is targeted at violent criminals and not at law-abiding citizens. Indeed, if we wanted to go further and really consider significant steps to stop violent crime, I would suggest we could consider legislation or a constitutional amendment to alter or repeal the exclusionary rule in criminal proceedings. Now, there is a rule that consistently excludes evidence of guilt from violent criminals and has resulted in violent criminals being freed over and over and over again. If the passion that is focused on this issue right now were targeted at preventing violent crime, I would suggest considering the impact of the exclusionary rule would be a far more fruitful area for actually stopping violent crime. Because I too, as many of the members of this committee, have worked in law enforcement for many, many years, have dealt with victims of crime, and think we need to be serious about protecting Americans from violent crime with every tool at our disposal. My fourth and final point is that the Constitution, in my opinion, should be the touchstone of everything we do. Some have suggested in this hearing that the role of Congress is to pass laws and it's up to the court to consider constitutionality. I would point out that every one of us takes an oath to defend the Constitution.
Thank you for the lecture.
And that is a fundamental obligation of every member of this body. There has been some suggestion that Heller would allow this regulation, I would point out that I am not unfamiliar with the Heller case. Indeed, I represented 31 states before the U.S. Supreme Court in the Heller case. So I have an intimate familiarity with that case, having been an active part of litigating it and winning 5-4 before the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court said in Heller, it did say there are some restrictions on the Second Amendment that are permissible. And for example, it specifically identified the current prohibition on fully automatic machine guns. But it also said that weapons that are in common use, such as, in that case, handguns, were the principal issue being discussed. And the same arguments that have been suggested here about why so-called assault weapons can be banned were made by the District of Columbia in Heller for why handguns could be banned. And the Supreme Court said, no, if they're in common use for self-defense, they cannot be banned consistent with the Second Amendment. We have heard testimony that there are some 4 million weapons that would be covered by this bill. I would suggest on any measure, 4 million weapons qualifies as in common use, and so under the terms of Heller, they cannot constitutionally be prohibited. The final point I would make on the Constitution is some have pointed to public opinion polls. In my view, the Constitution is particularly important when the Bill of Rights is unpopular. That was the entire purpose of the Bill of Rights. When our rights are popular, we don't need the Constitution. The purpose of it is to stand for the rights of the minority when the majority is acting to strip their rights. And I would note the senior senator from New York asked about other rights. I think we should be vigorous in protecting every right in the Constitution. Just last week, a number of us spent some 13 hours on the floor of the Senate defending the Fifth Amendment, and in particular, the right of Americans not to be denied their life without due process of law. And indeed, Senator Rand Paul and I have introduced legislation to make clear that the United States government cannot use a drone to kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil if that individual does not pose an imminent threat. And I would certainly welcome support from any of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle on that important protection of the Fifth Amendment just this week.
I don't want to, and will not cut the senator off. He's made the 5 of his 4 points.
Mr. Chairman, I would.
But we are going to have a vote in a few minutes, and I would ask him to, and I'll say if he wants to make a longer one, and I appreciate the lecture of what we're supposed to do as senators opposing the Constitution. I've been doing it for 38 years, but I'm always happy to have the reminder from somebody who's been here for
Mr. Chairman.
probably not quite as long, but I'd like to let some of the others,
But
if
I
you don't mind.
ask the gentleman a
Mr.
question.
Chairman, if I could have the 60 more seconds to conclude.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll do it later. Yeah, okay. He's got 60 seconds.
Likewise, earlier this week, this committee voted to fund a study of the impact of films and video games on violent crimes. And I would note that I voted no against that as well, because I believe in the First Amendment, I believe in the Second Amendment, I believe in the Fifth Amendment, and I would suggest that every one of us has an obligation to the Constitution. I will happily welcome support from anyone who wants to stand and fight for the Constitution, because in my view, that should be our principal responsibility and obligation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the senator, Senator Whitehouse.
Okay.
I'll